L'kutei Torah, Parshas Tzav, page Yud Gimel, bottom of the first column. This is a Maimarim in Tzav, but there are a lot of Pesach Maimarim. It's a month to Pesach, believe it or not.
Really?
A month. Today's the 15th, and listen, the 15th.
I'm cleaning already.
Sheishes Yom Teichel Matzah, 6 days you should eat matzahs. On the 7th day is a holding back. And we need to understand that here the pasuk says Sheishes Yom Teichel Matzahs. You eat matzahs for 6 days. It says before that it says Shivas Yom Teichel Matzahs. The pasuk before that says you should have matzah for 7 days. So is it 6 days or it's 7 days? So he said that, but before we would go into what Alter Rebbe has explained, the Gemara asks the question, it's a contradiction. One pasuk, Rashi brings it down in Chumash also. One pasuk says 6 days, one pasuk says 7 days. So the Gemara learns out an interesting thing. What does it mean basically? That one day you have to eat matzah, and all the other days are optional. That's what the Gemara learned out. But here he says, here, the primary purpose of this pasuk is not to tell us about eating matzah, but the main thing is, the main primary goal of this pasuk is to teach us that in the 7th day of Pesach is Yom Tov, meaning, so why does the Torah introduce that 6 days you should eat matzahs? What the pasuk means is in other words, the main goal of the pasuk is the title tell us on the 7th day is Yom Tov, which is Shvi Shal Pesach. But how do we get to the 7th day Yom Tov? That's by eating matzah 6 days. So now really, again, not going to the halacha. Really, the pasuk means 7 days you eat matzah, like the other pasuk says. But here the pasuk saying, how do you come to the 7th day being a Yom Tov? Through eating matzah 6 days. To understand what's the connection by eating matzah 6 days, that through this you come to Yom Tov on the 7th, and not only Yom Tov of Kriyas Yamsuf. What's the union of the 7th day? Now the Alter Rebbe is going to ask a different question. What is the whole inyan of Kriyas Yamsuf? I mean, the 7th day of Pesach is Kriyas Yamsuf. Right? So the Alter Rebbe is explaining, here the pasuk implies that only through eating matzah 6 days can you come to Shvi of Kriyas Yamsuf. But in Mitzrayim, they only had to eat matzah 1 day. So by eating matzah 1 day, they came to Shvi Shal Pesach. So now why? Now do we need to eat 6 days matzah to come to Shvi Shal Pesach? Hine Pesach Mitzrayim el Chimutz Neig Rak Yom Echad. L'cheira in Pesach Mitzrayim, the Gemara says there was only 1 day of not eating chametz. In Cain, Areizach l'Kriyas Yamsuf. So the original Kriyas Yamsuf the Jews merited. Shalei Aidei Chilas Matzah Kol Sheshes Yomim. By not eating matzah 6 days, they got it anyway. But Madur l'Deidah, so why in all generations do we need to Shivas Yom Teichol of matzahs? Why do we need now to have 7 days of matzah, 7 days of eating matzah? And not only that, Davka they Sheishes Yom Teichol matzahs, and Davka by eating matzah 6 days, can you come by days that Shiyuchol Nova Livchin Ziyeh Mashvi Atzeres? The Alter Rebbe says two things. Number one, if then they only kept matzah 1 day, why over here do we need 6 days and 7 days? The second thing, the original time they got to Kriyas Yamsuf by 1 day eating matzah. Now we need the reminder of it. We need 6 days. What?
What was the sequence of events that night? It was Micah before, and then they got up, and then they.
Paro woke up, and the Jews left the middle of the day.
They had matzah for 1 day.
Right.
And then they came to Kriyas Yamsuf.
7 days later.
Okay, so that's the sequence of.
Yeah.
The matzah was during the day of the 50th.
No, they had matzah at night together with the Korban Pesach. In Mitzrayim, they shechted the Korban Pesach Yudal in the afternoon.
Yes.
That night they ate matzah. Be'erev Techlu matzahs.
Yes.
That's it. Right? One day.
They had this.
Right?
That matzah is different.
I understand. You remember the whole Maamar?
No.
Okay, good. The Rebbe Marash told someone that a Maamar you have to learn 400 times and then you begin to see the light.
Really?
Yeah. Then you begin to see the light of the Maamar. I don't think we did it 400 times yet. Because we didn't live that long yet. The Gam Lahov and Madishvi Shel Pesach. The other thing we need to understand like this. By Shvi Shel Pesach, the pasuk says, "Atzeres LaHashem Elokecha." It's a holding back for Hashem. Shmini Atzeres, it also says Atzeres, but over there it says Atzeres Tia Lochem. It's Atzeres for you. Why by Shmini Atzeres it says an Atzeres holding back for you, and by Pesach it says LaHashem Elokecha. Gam, and also understand that they baked the dough that they took out of Mitzrayim round matzah. It couldn't become chametz. Why? Because they were driven out of Mitzrayim. The pasuk says, and the dough, they didn't have time to delay that the dough should rise. So one pasuk says, why did they eat matzah? Because the dough didn't have a chance to rise. That's what the pasuk says. The mashma, which implies, this is a reason, why did they bake matzah, not chametz? Because garshim and Mitzrayim, because practically speaking, the dough didn't have a chance to rise, yeah? This is wondrous. The Gemara says that even though the mitzvah matzah was eating at night, but for one day, night and day, they were not allowed to eat chametz. Yeah? So the Torah says like this. On the day of Pesach, the first day, the Torah says they baked matzah. Why did they bake matzah? Because it couldn't become, physically didn't have enough time to become chametz. So now the Rebbe says, but the fact is they were obligated not to eat chametz anyway one day. So they couldn't, even if they wanted to, they couldn't have had chametz. So why did the Torah say, why did they have matzah? Because they physically didn't have enough time for the dough to rise. How were they able to bake chametz? That you needed reason, because they were driven out of Mitzrayim. Like, why? It doesn't make sense. Anyway, they were not allowed to eat matzah. Gam lahov and mashakos. Also to understand what we say in our God, matzah zoshana echem al shumah. Why do we eat the matzah? Shim shlahir b'b'tzei shav v'seinu la'achmitz. The dough didn't have a chance to rise. We say on our God, right? And there are three things that Gamliel said. So matzah zoshana echem al shumah. Ashum shlahir b'b'tzei shav v'seinu la'achmitz. It didn't have a chance to rise. Even without that, they had to eat matzah anyway, the Torah says. This that Hashem revealed himself. When did Hashem reveal himself in Mitzrayim? It was after midnight. But the mitzvah of eating matzah was before Chatzos. Why? Like we say every day in davening, the Korban Pesach they had to eat before Chatzos. Right? That means like this. There was a mitzvah of eating matzah that night together with the Korban Pesach, which was only eaten until midnight. That means the commandment of eating matzah was before midnight. When did Nigla Aleim Melech Malchei Amlochem B'Kodesh Baruch Hu? After midnight. Our matzah that we eat is before chatzos. How could it be that this matzah that we eat? By the way, it's interesting. According to halacha, you're not made yetzer matzah if you eat it after midnight. If you eat matzah after halacha at midnight, you didn't do the mitzvah. The mitzvah of eating matzah is dafka before b'erev techlu matzah together with the Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach was only allowed to be eaten until midnight. Right? So therefore, the matzah we eat. Yet, why do we eat the matzah? We say Nagada because the Nigla Aleh Malch Malchi Amloch. So l'chayre, we eat the matzah before Chatzos. That reason was for the matzah after Chatzos. So how do you reconcile all this stuff? So the Alter Rebbe asks a bunch of questions. Number one pasuk says 6 days eat matzah. Another pasuk says 7 days eat matzah. Secondly, the pasuk over there says, so he says, what is the pasuk teaching us? Not so much to eat matzah, because really eat matzah 7 days. What is the pasuk teaching us? That Atzeres Hashem L'kach, that the 7th day is Yom Tov. Therefore, what does the pasuk mean? By eating matzah 6 days, through that you come to the kedusha of the 7th day, which is Kriyas Yamsuf. So the Rebbe asks another question. L'chayra, in Mitzrayim, they only had matzah 1 day, and yet they merited the real Kriyas Yamsuf then. And now we need 6 days to get to Kriyas Yamsuf. And then a whole bunch of questions. He says, by Shvish Pesach it says, Atzeres Hashem Elokecha, by Atzeres, Shmin Atzeres Atzeres Yilachem. And also, what do we see? The pasuk says, why did they eat matzah? Because it didn't have time to rise, when they're anyway obligated to eat matzah for 24 hours. Okay, so a whole bunch of questions. Okay, so what's the inyan? The inyan is like this. When the Torah says in the pasuk in Parshas Bay, you should eat matzah ba'erev in the evening, it says matzah is chosir vav. Normally matzah, plural, is mem tzadik vav sof. If you look in the Sefer Torah Chumash, ba'erev teichlu matzah, the matzah is without a vav, just mem tzadik sof. When it speaks about the baking that they didn't have a chance to rise, it says uges matzahs, it says molivav, with the vav. So the matzah before chatzos, the Torah says without a vav. The matzah they ate after chatzos, when they were running out of Egypt, is with the vav. Now what's the union of vav? I know vav zo hamshacha shenigla le'malch malchi amloch. The vav is the hamshach of melech malchi amloch. Remember we learned vav is up to down. Vav represents hamshacha. Remember we learned kodesh with the vav, without a vav, hamshacha coming down. So it says like this. I know vav is the hamshacha shenigla le'malch malchi amloch. If that's the case, are you based bechinas matzah? In Mitzrayim, there are two distinct levels of matzah. And even in Pshat of the pasuk, there had to be two different matzahs. One matzah they were commanded to eat, b'erev teichlu matzahs. That's before they left. Makkos b'cheres was at midnight, right? They had to put the blood on the doorpost, and they had to eat matzah together with the carbon Pesach. Then, when they were leaving Egypt, Ki gorshu mi Mitzrayim. So again, the dough didn't have a chance to rise. So that means there's two levels of matzah. There was a matzah before chatzos that they were commanded to eat. And then there was another level of matzah after chatzos they weren't commanded to eat, but the Torah says a reason, because the dough didn't have a chance to rise.
Is it possible they were different things?
What do you mean different things?
Different matzahs.
There were different matzah.
I know, but I mean, even taste different, even the texture different, or...
I mean, one was thinner, one was thicker, one was...
One was whole wheat, Rabbi, and one was plain.
Schwarzemel and Weissemel. What?
They're not matzah in this time.
I think that, if I'm not mistaken, I think the Ibn Ezra or other Mefarshim explain that but the Jews in Egypt ate matzah because it's a very cheap food. And that's in its filling. So that's what they would give the Jews to eat, the slaves. Lahavdil in South Africa during the apartheid. So what did they feed the maids over there, the slaves? They fed them porridge. It was a porridge. It was very cheap and very filling, and that's what they gave them to eat. So some of I think it's Ibn Ezra, maybe one of those guys in the Chumash, explained that the people in Mitzrayim, the Jews were given matzah a whole year. But they weren't commanded to eat it. Now they were commanded to eat it. So there are two levels of matzah. Mashakos, the bed of Techlu matzah, which is matzah of Kedem Chatzeis before midnight. That's the matzah without the vav. V'abeid Mashakos v'yerfa amma ugois matzahs. V'u matzah shalach Chatzeis, whom moli vav is with the vav, meaning after nigla aleim. In other words, the vav represents Gilui of Elokus. When was the Gilui of Elokus? At midnight. So the matzah day before midnight was the Gilui without Chatzei, with the matzah without the revelation. So therefore it's matzah without the vav. Matzah is without the vav, it didn't have the Gilui of Elokus. The matzah day after Chatzei was after Nigla Aleim Melech Malchei Amlach M'Kodesh Baruch Hu. So over there it was with the vav.
Is there a Rashi that says Matzah lasted 14 days?
Yeah. So, but not
66 meals, right?
but they weren't commanded yet.
I understand, but if they had Matzah for 14 days, there was no Kipazon.
Not 14 days. The matzah they baked when they were running out lasted.
For how many days?
Whatever. Until the month fell. After Kriyas Yamsuf.
They made it for so long, it was Kipazon.
Yeah. They were running away, the Egyptians were chasing them. No, so they ran away.
So the whole idea of matzah was not because it was a cheap food.
No, now when they were going out, they said, some Farshim learned that they gave matzah because it's not matzah today. Matzah today is very expensive. But if you don't have to make sure it's not chametzik, you don't need shmur, you don't need flour that was watched from the time of harvest, then you don't need it. Okay, okay, number about God, the different that God it says, matzah zu shanu echem al shumba, that the matzah that we eat al shum shlihit b'tzeiger shal v'seinu, la'ach ad la'ach mitzah shenigla mel malchim lachem kodesh boch, which is matzahs with the vav. So now the Alter Rebbe is explaining like this. He asked, one of the questions he asked was, how do we eat the matzah before midnight? Yet, we say in the Haggadah, the matzah we eat is resemblance of the matzah after Nigla Aleim. Right? So it's two opposite matzahs. One's before Chatzos and one's after Chatzos. So the Alter Rebbe is explaining now that what the Haggadah is saying is, matzah zu sha'anu eichlim, this matzah that we eat before Chatzos, which is really without the revelation of Hashem, is in correspondence with the matzah they ate after Chatzos. Kigorshim in Mitzrayim, right? So he says, matzah shana echlem gamkim b'china zu. The matzah we eat before Chatzos is the same revelation of matzah they had after midnight, meaning, midiksiv sheishes yom teichel matzahs b'vav. This proves the matzah the matzah that we eat is also mechin madrega zu. Therefore, through this we could bring down Yom Hashvi Atzeres. So the Alter Rebbe says like this: the matzah we eat today, even though it's before Chatzos, it's the matzah that they ate after Chatzos. That means, based on this, we don't have matzah anymore before Chatzos. We only have the matzah after Chatzos. And later on, the Alter Rebbe is going to explain why is that, because now we're after Matan Torah. So this is all before Matan Torah. After Matan Torah, therefore it's accomplished that the matzah we eat before Chatzos is the same gilui of matzah after Chatzos.
The kids are not going to say for after Chatzos to eat matzah anyway.
It depends what else they're eating along the way. You know how many dinim in Shulchan Aruch it says you have to do things to keep the kids up by the Seder? In those days they didn't have computerized toys. They used to play with nuts on the floor, like marbles. It says you have to give the kids nuts Erev Pesach that they should get excited and stay up. Then you do things at the Seder just the kids should ask questions. You do a lot of things the kids should stay up. They don't sleep, the kids stay. The kids are up. Okay. So he says now, Lovin calls that to understand all this. This is the concept we learned in many Maimorim. Tzarech lahat chumash koso, a totally different inyan. Says, Kiloi ala lechem levada yichya adam. A man does not live on bread alone. Right? That's what the pasuk says in Ekev. A man does not live on bread alone, but he lives on, simply means kol meitza pi Hashem. Everything else God created. So he says, the bezem to the tzakushya. So he quotes this from the Arizal. The Arizal says, this answers the question, Ech yesh b'koyach hamaychel. How is it possible that food has the lahachis sa'adam? How is it possible that food could sustain a person? Why? Bread comes from a plant. And a person is 2 levels higher, the level of a person. Normally, in order to be sustained, you have to be sustained from something above you, not below you. Yet, here we find that plant, bread, which bread includes all foods, bread sustains a person. So now the Rabbi says, L'chayra, bread is only plant, and a person is medaber, the human. How in the world is it possible that a person could be sustained from food? So he says, this is what the pasuk is answering. What the pasuk means to say, that Arizal says, a person doesn't live on the bread alone, meaning it's not the bread that gives us life. Arizal says the word of Hashem that's in the bread. You don't sustain yourself from the bread alone. What do you sustain yourself from? Doesn't mean other stuff. It means the word of Hashem that's in the bread. Which word of Hashem? When Hashem said, the earth should sprout out vegetation, that word of Hashem comes into the food, and that's what gives life to the person. So the Alter Rebbe is saying this from the Arizal. What is the Alter Rebbe saying? That what does the pasuk mean? A man does not live on bread alone. It means you don't live from the physical bread. You're sustaining yourself from the word of Hashem that's in the bread. So the Alter Rebbe asks, when Hashem created Adam, the body of Adam, because when Hashem he blew in. When Hashem created the body of Adam, he said, Nasa Adam. So there is a word of Hashem in the person. Right? So why do we need the word of Hashem that's in the food? We have our own word of Hashem in us, so why do we need to live on the word of Hashem that's in the bread? Why do we need to live from the bread? That has the power of Tachi Aretz. We have our own power, which is a higher power. Based on what's explained in many places, the level of inanimate plant and animal, Shoshan comes from the world of Tehu. There is a world of Tehu, a spiritual world, by the way. It's not a physical world. There's a world of Tehu, and there's a world of Tikkun. Right? And we know the Kabbalah says there was Shviras HaKelim of Tehu. In this world of Tehu, which that world of Tehu means, why was it void, like there was no substance to it? Because there was abundance of light and minimal kelim. When you have too much odd and too little keli, too much light and too little vessel, so the vessel explodes. If you want to do that, I'll give you a mashal you could do at home, or maybe you shouldn't. Take a glass jar, fill it up with water to the top, and put it in your freezer for a day. That will explain Shviras HaKelim of Tehu in a physical sense. Okay? But don't tell your wife, I told you to do it. Okay? So what's going to happen? It's going to explode. Why? Because it expands, so there's too much odd for the keli, so the keli breaks. Now what happened? Again, this is spiritual kelim. This is not something that happened 5,784 years ago. This is above time and place. It's continuously happening. So what happened? There was too much odd, too little kelim. So this is part of the plan, by the way. It should be shviras kelim. And then, like we learned, how many sparks fell down? 288 sparks. Rapach nitzutzim. Okay? Rapach nitzutzim fell down. And then these are the sparks that come from this loftier world of Tehu. Now comes into Tikkun. And now we have to elevate those sparks back to where they came from. But because they come from a loftier place, they're actually higher than us. By the way, the Alter Rebbe says in Torah Or, where do we see, I mean, it's a Kabbalistic concept, but where do you see there's Rapach Nitzutzim? So the Alter Rebbe brings down, the beginning of Chumash, it says, Obroch Elokim Merachefes Al Pnei Hamoyim. The Spirit of Hashem hovered over the water. If you take the word Merachefes, the first and last letter is Mem Sof, which is Mes, and the middle letters are Rapach, which means Rapach Mes, meaning those 288 sparks of Kedusha died, meaning they fell down. And those are the sparks that we need to elevate. They're mixed in with Tikkun. When the Eden left Mitzrayim, it says in the Pasuk, V'gam Erev Rav Ola Itam, meaning the Erev Rav, the multitude, the Egyptians that left with the Jews. But Kabbalah explains, Erev means Taruvis, of Rav, of Reish Beis. When the Jews left Egypt, don't forget, all the money in the civilized world was brought to Egypt during the hunger. The Jews, when they went out of Egypt, took all that money with them. They emptied out Egypt. So they elevated, when they went out of Egypt, 202 out of the 288. That's what it says, Gam Erev Rav, Taruvis of Reish Beis, Olu Itam, they elevated. So now we're left with 86, which is numerically Elokim, and that's the Avodah of a Jew now until Mashiach comes, is to elevate those parts. Look at the Torah, Parshat Sav, page Yud Gimel. 8 lines from the end of the page. Okay, the Alter Rebbe asked a number of questions. One pasuk says 6 days, it says eat matzah, another pasuk says 7 days. So it doesn't mean that necessarily. It means you were eating matzah 6 days, you come to the 7th day, which is Yom Tif. So he says, why by Yetzias Mitzrayim was it enough eating matzah 1 day, and now we have to do it 7 days? Also by Pesach it says, Atzeres Hashem Elokecha, and by Shmini Atzeres it says, Atzeres Ti Elochem. So he starts explaining the whole thing. Why did they have to eat matzah? They were anyway commanded to eat matzah. So the Alter Rebbe says that this matzah that we eat is the mitzvah after midnight, but there was a matzah before midnight and there's a matzah after midnight. Then he started to understand all this. We need to understand what it's pasuk says, you don't live on bread alone, which means you live from the Dvar Hashem. So Rizal says, a person has his own Dvar Hashem, his own word of Hashem keeping in existence, and he answers that comes from Tehu because it's lower, and a person comes from Tikkun. Therefore, in essence, the inanimate plant animal are even higher than the human in the source. So therefore, you can sustain itself. So those things come from the world of Tehu. The person comes in the world of Tikkun. The primary level of Tikkun is Chochmah Vatzilus. And it's called bringing down the level of Seichel, Ki b'Chochmah is Beriru. Because you're able to select, meaning you need Seichel in order to differentiate between good and bad. Therefore, because a person primarily is a level of Seichel, what's the level of Seichel? That Sheirish Ishtal Shaluso, Gam given the level of Chochmah. The Alter Rebbe is just explaining the uniqueness of a person is Seichel. Seichel is Chochmah Vatzilus. That's the world of Tikkun. The Shviras HaKelim, Shoya Ba'elam HaTehu. The Shviras HaKelim that was in the world of Tehu, that was the level of Zayin Midas. Because what it says in Kabbalah, What level of Shviras HaKelim was there in Atzilus? Not the Seichel of Tehu, but the Midas of Tehu. But that level of Midas, of Tehu, even though normally Chachma is higher than Midas, intellect stimulates feelings, but over here we're talking about the Midas of Tehu, which is much higher than the level of Seichel of Tikkun. Like, and that's called, what's called in Kabbalah, Behema Rabbah. There's a normal behemoth, then there's the big behemoth. That's the level of tail. Skip the brackets. 1 second, next page. Top of the page of 26. What? Tikkun. But because in the midas of Tehu, there was no unity. Like this, we have chesed of gvura, gvura of chesed. Over there, chesed is chesed and gvura is gvura and tiferes is tiferes. It says nish enough because therefore, because there was no unity, there was no keli. If there was no keli, so there was too much odd for no keli, very little keli. So therefore, the kelim broke. The name same lamata me'adam. Therefore, they come down lower than a person. Lochein tzrichem le'izbarei de adam dafka. Therefore, they're needed to be elevated, right? Through a person, Chachma is beridu, because Chachma, you need Chachma to be able to separate between good and bad. So he says like this: why does Tehu need to be elevated through Tikkun? Because he needs Seichel, which is Tikkun, to be able to differentiate. But Achlach Hashem is baridim. But after the person refines the food, he eats it and he refines it. Hey, mechayes ha'adam. It gives sustenance to the person. Mitzat shashim shulamayla me'adam. Because it's in essence, the source is higher than Adam. But it fell down here. But when the person refines, separates the good out of the bad of Tehu, so then what happens? It reveals the source of Tehu, and therefore it's able to sustain the person.
In order to have the set of people,
Right. That's what it says. On the word of Hashem's mouth, the person lives. It doesn't say, now there, I'll never say nothing like this. It doesn't say Dvar Hashem. It's Matzah Pi Hashem. Matzah means the source of the dibur, not the dibur itself. V'zau ki al kol Matzah Pirish, Matzah Pi Hashem is the mark of a shadish, is their origin and the source. Shemisham nimshcholi is Gili HaMaimoris, that there should be the source of the 10 utterances. Mipi Hashem, u'b'chinas mekerim v'shashim ari alechem nilkach m'b'chinas al yena yisem. Therefore, in that source of the Matzah Pi Hashem, meaning the source of the words of Hashem, over there, the person, the Tehu is higher than Tikkun. Therefore, the question was, how can a person sustain himself from food lower than them? The answer is because in the source, that's higher than the person.
so why in Misiut Pesach Torah, we say it was bad, you should say the source.
No, Torah comes from Tikkun. Torah is Chochmas V'Shogarish Baruch. And B'chein is okay. V'zeh hatam.
Rabbi, they had no Torah in Kofu.
Now it's a different level of Torah. Higher than Atzilus, its Torah is in a different level. It's a level, like we said, Hashem's toy, not the wisdom of Hashem.
Can anything exist without
Without,
any level, without Torah?
no.
At any level.
Because it's Taku Baraisa Bara Alma. Now, if Hashem looked into Torah to create the world, Alma means any world, Teo, Tekon, whatever it is. All worlds, all worlds, all worlds. Therefore, this element of Nasa Adam is Achrim Basarim Maimoris. So in other words, now the Alter Rebbe says another thing. This explains why the last of all the utterances is the one that's make man. Okay, why? It all comes before Nasa Adam, bitamen out for the reason. Because they come from the world of Tehu. That comes before Tikkun, Shesham Sheder Sha'adam, where the person's the sources. So in other words, like this, what happens is, and this is one of the reasons, by the way, there's other reasons why a person was created last. But here the Alter Rebbe is saying one of the reasons why a person was created last is because vegetation and all that stuff comes from a higher level than Adam. So the lowest level is Adam. And therefore all these things are able to sustain the person. Therefore the Gemara says, Rav Nachman said, the reason I didn't answer your question in the evening, the Gemara tells a story. Somebody asked Rav Nachman a question and he couldn't answer it. The next morning he sees him, he says, you know I didn't answer you at night? Because I didn't eat dinner, and because I didn't eat meat, so my brain wasn't working well, and therefore I wasn't able to answer you. The Mizan move on, that the food adds also like everybody knows, when you don't eat, your brain doesn't function as well as when you eat. Why is it? And that means it's not, one second, that means even more. The food is influencing the seichel of the person, not only the midas of the person, the living of the person. It influences even the seichel of the person. How could that be? Because he says the source of it is higher than the seichel of the person. So when a person eats it, that's what happens. The same thing Chazal say, a baby doesn't know how to say Abba or father, whatever, until he eats. In order for a baby to speak or to call even father, he needs to eat tam dogan, grain. Why? Which is higher than Chochmah of Tikkun. Therefore, it has the power and the ability can even add into the wisdom of a person. Okay? So therefore this is in Gashmias. It says, the same thing we're talking about spiritually.
Means the more we eat, the more chokhmah we have.
By the way, excessive eating puts you to sleep. So anything in excess is no good.
No, but if it's coming from Tikkun, the source, means the more.
But that has to be the proper birur and the proper keli. So it has to be a birur of X amount of food. Shazel inyan birurim. Shazel inyan birurim. This is the aved of refining the pachnitzutz of the tehu. Shemelbashim b'dvarim agashmi. They dress themselves into the physical object. Shemizbadin va'edom l'mayla. They become elevated in the level of tikkun, which is sheidish nefesh ulikis. See, the Alter Rebbe is saying, what's the aved of the Jew? The aved of the Jew is take the sparks of tehu that are in klipas neiga and elevate them to kedusha, which in essence reveals a greater level of elukus than the Jew has on his own. The person comes from tikkun, and this comes from tehu. Through the aved of Hashem b'krishma tefillah, Shabachin is Kerech Chayis. This Chayis that the person gets through eating, Sheniteis by the Achila, L'Shem Shemayim, Unechlo be'echad, becomes part of echad v'ahavta. Umeis of Kerech is brain, and it adds the power of meditation. Again, like you said before, if you don't eat, the brain doesn't work. So when you eat and the meditating causes more avos Hashem and v'yahavta, v'izparas Hashem la'Hashem liyas beinus adas v'avi yir b'teikev v'izkashus yosef more than the nefesh shel the kiss itself. Now that's the reason because in this food that's causing fitzit l'shem shemayim, like he says, is causing the sparks of teil, which are higher than tikkun b'chol al kain. Therefore, therefore they're able to add greatness, even to the level of chochma midah shebenefesh shel the kiss. But Krishma, Tefillah, Pesach, Torah Or Maamar. Okay, so now this is not yet, this is only introduction to understand the level of Matzah. Because Al Rebbe said to understand this whole inyan of Matzah, before Chatzos, after Chatzos, all that stuff. He says we have to understand first, so Al Rebbe is explaining, the bottom line is, you don't live from the physical food, you live from the word of Hashem. Why we have our own word of Hashem? Why do we need the word of Hashem in the food? The answer is it comes from Teil. And therefore we come from Tikkun, and therefore when a person eats food, and L'Shem Shemayim, Brach, and everything, they elevate the food, and therefore that causes the ability for the person to have a greater understanding of Elokus. So in other words, the Neshama can only do this down here. In Gan Eden, the Neshama can't do this. Because you don't have physical things in Gan Eden that you could elevate. So therefore the purpose of the neshama coming down into the body, into physical things, dealing Torah mitzvahs with physical things, is to elevate those sparks of tail which are higher than tikkun, and therefore it's a greater revelation of Elokus in the world. And this explains why Torah mitzvahs are dafkin gashmistic things. Or, as it's explained, the pasuk b'chol derechecha da'ehu, or kol masecha l'shem shemayim, not only in mitzvahs, but even why did Hashem make that we need to eat food? Hashem could have made that we don't have to eat. Or we can eat once a week, once a month, once a year. Why did they wish to make that we should eat halachically twice a day, and Shabbos 3 times a day? So why is it? Because Hashem wants us to elevate the sparks of Kedusha. But that's only when a guy does it in Shem Shemayim. When they eat to live, not live to eat.
You can still raise the spark of Kedusha once a month intensely.
But you see, you weren't on the class last night. There are certain mitzvahs that are daily, certain mitzvahs weekly, certain mitzvahs monthly, certain mitzvahs yearly, certain mitzvahs every 7 years, certain mitzvahs every 50 years. Right? Yaivul. Yes? Okay. Why are there certain mitzvahs that need to be done every day? In other words, when you eat matzah and Pesach, yeah? Let's speak about Pesach. You're coming up. You have a biblical mitzvah to eat matzah. That's only one night a year. Now, the Kedusha you bring down when you eat matzah lasts for a year. That makes sense. You bring down Kedusha, but you only do it once a year. That means that Kedusha lasts until the next year. Tefillin on the other, or Shabbos, let's say. Shabbos, you only do Shabbos once a week. The biblical mitzvah of Kiddush, not on a cup, the biblical mitzvah of Kiddush, Zochim Shabbos Akatshe. That mitzvah is done once a week and lasts until the next Shabbos. Then you have daily, you put on Tefillin every day. That means that Hamshacha is needed to be done every day. So, yeah, Hashem could have said we could eat once a month and elevate the food that way, but then we eat much less. So Hashem wants us to eat every day, that we elevate for whatever reason. That's the cheshbon. That you eat every day, you elevate the sparks of every day.
I mean, this means that people who elevate with the right training through the proper work have more access to Chokhmah than the people that don't.
Correct. Chokhmah of Kedusha. Chokhmah of Kedusha, we're talking.
They're smarter than them, or one tefach. They are smarter than them.
Ahead.
What was that?
Because
They're ahead of other people.
they have more access to it. They're doing the right thing.
Many tzaddikim used to fast. According to the Alter Rebbe, it's forbidden to fast nowadays. He's just saying conceptually, the level of gashmis that you're elevating l'shem shemayim. Now, when Teil fell down, a lot of sparks fell into Shosh Kibsat Tameis. A lot of sparks fell into Klipas Nega, those you could elevate. Sometimes it falls into Shosh Kibsat Tameis, those you can't elevate. You have to push them away.
Yeah, but the Rabbi is saying if you have the proper care, you're doing the proper eating, proper way, you have access to chokhmah.
Yeah, but it also depends the type of brain Hashem gave the person. A better brain, not such a better brain. Or it also depends on the level of the neshama. In Tanya, the Alter Rebbe constantly says, based, when he speaks about learning Torah, based on your mental ability and sheidish nishmasi l'mayla. It depends on your neshama a lot also. A greater neshama can have a greater understanding of Torah than the person who's smarter, but not such a great level of neshama. Remember we learned about Shem Tov said, any question somebody asks in Torah he could answer, any statements in Torah somebody says he could refute. So what's the explanation of it? Because a question in a lower world, in a higher world, there's an answer to it. Or a statement in a lower world, in a higher world, it's more difficult to understand. In other words, in not understanding, I told many times the story, Rabbi Kiva Eger was a contemporary of the Mittler Rebbe. They met. He was a brilliant, brilliant scholar. Okay? He once came, and he had a lot of questions in learning. There's a commentary on the side of the Gemara, Tzarachi and Gadol. When he asked Tzarachi and Gadol, you really need a big looking into it. So, he once came into a simple village, and there were people learning Gemara, and the teacher was sitting there, and he's teaching the Balabatim Gemara. And they understood it, they shake their head, they understood it, yeah. And they close the Gemara and they go home. He was listening to the class. Afterwards, he started crying. He said, look at this. They understand the Gemara and I don't. They merited to understand the Gemara, but I don't. But his not understanding is infinitely greater than their understanding. So there's different levels of understanding and not understanding. So based on your level of neshama, if you have a loftier neshama, there are aspects of Torah you could understand that a lower neshama can't, even though the head might be greater. So there's a lot of issues involved in all this.
I think the head has something to do with neshama.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily.